Hi, my name is Dana Reed. I have been shooting as Firefly photography since 2010, and I specialize in portraiture, and my approach, I guess, is sort of a dreamy quality to it. And I'm here at the AVA Gallery, and my home is in West Lab.
You mentioned on your website that your style is inspired by early children's book illustration.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any book in particular that you feel was a main inspiration?
Not really. My favorite children's story is The Secret Garden, and so it's not so much to illustrations with regard to that story, but it's sort of that like wild sort of connection to nature, sort of gothic, you know, the big house on the British moors, and so a lot of what I really like about early children's illustrations is like the sort of fantastical, sort of dreamy element to the work, and that's what kind of draws me in, and the sort of confluence of humans and nature.
How important is capturing a moment to you? Either a moment in nature, like a specific season, or a major life moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty important, I would think, for most photographers, but I can't speak for everybody. But for me, yeah, I mean, I recently, we were in Arizona recently, so talking about a specific moment, I really wanted to capture a sunrise at the Grand Canyon, so we rounded up at 2 a.m., drove 2 hours to get there to catch the sunrise. So yeah, a moment is important, and it could be either, you know, planned, like that one was, or spontaneous. So a lot of times when I'm doing portraiture with people, you know, it's a lot of posed and it's a bit contrived, and I can't help that, that's part of it. But I'm also like kind of at the ready for those in-between moments where someone's laughing or something happens or there's just a more genuine moment. And so those moments, unplanned, small, but also significant, are also a part of my approach.
Yeah. How do you use Photoshop and photo editing to enhance the story and meaning of your photography?
I was literally just thinking about this because I like a lot of electronic music, and you might think of that as like fraudulent. You're not actually playing an instrument, you're pressing buttons and this and that. And I kind of think in the same way with Photoshop. It's not straight out of camera. I'm in Photoshop a lot. I unapologetically use Photoshop as much as I can. There's so many tools, and like electronic music, and I also like acoustic too. I like it all. I like all the tools that are given to me to enhance my work. I did read an article somewhere once that said you cannot make a bad picture good with Photoshop. Like if it's, you know, not properly exposed, or, you know, it's like overexposed, for example, or if it's not in focus, like I can't fix that. But if there's an already like well executed image, you can use Photoshop to do all kinds of stuff. And I work extensively in Photoshop. I have an image behind me, for example, where I don't know what you can see there, but where I've layered multiple photos into one to create a multi-exposure look, kind of a digital mixed media approach. So I do anything from a very light edit on something, and typically I try to do a light edit because I want people to look like themselves, not like somebody else. That's not my goal. But when I have a little more creative freedom with some of my own creative work, that's when I can go off the chain a little bit and get into Photoshop more deeply. But I use it a lot.
I noticed a few of your photographs are named after children's stories, such as The Secret Garden and Alice in Wonderland. Mm-hmm. Do you go into these shoots with these stories as inspiration, or do you name them after you've taken the photos?
Kind of a little bit of both. With the Alice in Wonderland shoot that I did in 2011, so that's now 12 years ago, to date myself. That was probably the first stylized shoot I ever did, and as you could probably see from the images, I had a lot to learn, but still. But you know, with that one, clearly I went in with, you know, I think 2 carloads worth of stuff into a state park in New Jersey where I was living at the time, and kids and people and everything was sort of planned ahead of time. So I would say mostly sort of planned ahead of time, but kind of open to change and being flexible with like a changing condition or a changing situation, and kind of like that. Yeah.
When did you first experiment with your style of photography and editing?
Yeah, it was probably around that time, I would say, because I was learning. I kind of put the cart before the horse, like a lot of people do. With my business, I didn't really know what I was doing. I can flatly admit that now, and I know I'm not alone there. I didn't charge much, you know, because I was still learning and people knew I was still learning. But once I felt more comfortable with the camera, I felt like that freed me up to put more energy into Photoshop and just learning Photoshop. I did a lot of online courses and just looked at books, you know, and I got to, you know, just bring a picture up and say, okay, what do I click on next? And what's this button do? And, you know, and just sort of going from there. So I would say probably around that time, about 12 years ago.
Yeah. Well, looking through your website, I noticed that a lot of your photos are taken in flower bushes, but not always ones that are like secluded in nature. Mm-hmm. How do you use editing to create such whimsical photos, even when they aren't taken in like a very whimsical place?
Yeah. So there's a British photographer named Bella Kotak who I like a lot. And she's very inspiring. She'll be like on the side of the road in like a bush and there's cars zooming by and her pictures are like so fantastic. I'm like, that's amazing that you did that. Because a lot of property is private. I don't always have access to a beautiful space, you know. So it's pretty easy. I mean, you can actually select a part of your picture. Like I'm thinking some azaleas, some like bright pink azaleas. I can just select a piece of the picture in Photoshop and just slap it down somewhere else, and I can make the canvas bigger and I can just make it look bigger and I can move pieces around and I can blend pieces together, and so that's all a Photoshop trick that I do, for sure.
Is there anything like cool you learned about Photoshop while just like playing around? Like any like cool feature you found? Yeah,
I mean, I think probably my favorite feature in Photoshop is layer properties. So like I think of it as almost like, again, another music reference. Like there's different layers to music. There's like your bass, your drums, your vocals. You know, there's all these like layers that you layer on top. And I think of it as like almost like a Xerox paper, or like, you know, photocopy paper too, like a transparency. Or one layer may be fully transparent. One may be almost not transparent, almost fully opaque, and you can't see what's under it, but just a little bit. Then you can erase out certain areas, and then you can change the property of each one of those layers. I don't know, I could go down the rabbit hole with this, but just playing with the properties of the layers. How do you want that layer to behave in this multi-layered entity that will be this one thing at the end, but it really is comprised. And I can show an example of that if you want to, if we're able to. I'm not sure if that's doable, but like, how does each layer behave? Having control over that is super cool. Yeah.
A lot of your pictures, people are wearing like a cool like headpiece or like an awesome outfit. Do you design those yourselves, or do you have people bring stuff like that?
Yeah, I designed it myself. Some of them haven't worked out too well, and some of them worked out really well. So I kind of like play around, and sometimes it's falling apart. I'm trying to stick it together, and a lot of it's really just costumey, so it's not meant to last. So some things you don't know that it's like just pinned in the back, or we're just holding it together for the photo. But it looks pretty cool at the end result, and a lot of times it's taken fully from nature. So there was one shoot I did during COVID where I put flowers on a mask. I literally had to forage them, like, I think it was either that day, and the shoot was in the evening, and then I had to like quick and like glue gunning them all on before they die, you know? And then the next day they were just completely dead, which is kind of cool because to me that's symbolic of the temporary nature of all things, that everything is temporary, nothing lasts forever. And so it's kind of that same kind of idea that I really admire. Like I was watching some Buddhist monks make a sand painting. I don't know if you've ever seen one of those things. And the level of like energy and intention that went into the sand painting, only for it to be like blown away into the wind. I was just completely like, what is that? You know, and I have a lot of respect for something that's, I guess this is a bit antithetical because I'm taking a picture of it and capturing it forever. But I love the idea of the elements kind of being fleeting, even the people in them. We're not going to be here forever. So. Yeah. So like I was saying, Photoshop is a big part of my work, specifically my creative work. And I'm really interested in botany. I'm really interested in the temporary nature of things. My work has sort of a feminine, dreamy sensibility to it, and that's kind of, I guess, my personality. Anyway, so this is the finished image, but I'm going to show you kind of it broken down. So what I saw here actually at the AVA Gallery, let me just toggle over, was a hydrangea bush, which we're gonna see in about a few weeks to a month from now. It's gonna be super awesome. And so I saw that bush and said, I'd like to put somebody in it and take a picture. And so I did. And so I put a friend of mine named Victoria, who was totally up for it, and I put her in the bush, took her pictures. And I have a whole series of pictures with her that I worked with that are completely different from this other one that I'm going to talk about. But for the purposes of this conversation, let's talk about what I did. So, one thing I did in this picture is I worked with lots of layers, and what you're looking at here are layers. And I needed a base image to play with. So let me go back to my base image. So what I did was I kind of like cut and pasted or clone stamped, or I forget exactly what technique I used. The white, just to have it a somewhat, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Evenish color around her. That's obviously much lighter, and her tone is a little darker. So when I'm playing with image properties, they'll behave differently on her than they will on the background, which is what I was looking for. So I purposely created that contrast between her and the background and tried to even it out a little bit. So this is what I'm starting with. And so if I take out the layers one by one, you'll see how things change. And we'll go back to where I started. So you'll see it in reverse. This is where I started. And it looks really easy. I'm just clicking on a button and the layers come back, but this takes hours to like figure out which flowers do I want to use, where do I want to put it, what's the layer property, and things like of that nature. So, this was a piece of botanical, and I need to, one thing I'm committing to now is plant identification and really getting into what's in the picture so I can identify what's in the picture. That's becoming more important to me. Messing with color, messing with all kinds of stuff. You can see that I'm slowly adding things in. I'm adding some of these in. I'm adding more in. And for example, this layer property is soft light. Let me try to remember that because I'm going to change it right now. If I make it multiply, it looks different. I bring down this drop down menu and I have so many choices. I can do exclusion, which looks different, Let's go back to soft light though. All right. I wanted to create sort of a soft color fill. All this is a plain pink layer. I wanted a pink sheen to it. And I also gave that screen lightens it up. So by contrast, multiply would darken it. So this one I use screen. Although I will say I use the multiply layer a lot in my family portraits to darken backgrounds. These were some pink flowers that I took photos of probably 10 years ago. I just wanted to give it a pink kind of tone. And then I wanted to calm the pink tone down, so I put a color balance layer in. So that's an example of that particular picture that you saw on the wall. And then I have another one behind me. I won't get into all the details. This one has more layers, but similar thing where I'm using, here I can take all the layers out and you can see the picture that I started with. Bringing it down, bringing it down, bringing it down. There's a reason why things are like masked out. All right, I must have already put the blue in at some point. I must have done stuff like, there's a reason why I did this, but that's the general picture that I started with. And then, whoops, I ended with this one, whoops. Just adding things in. And again, this is an incredibly oversimplification of the process. It literally takes me hours to figure this all out. Hours and hours and hours. Sometimes I have to leave it and come back. So that's kind of an example of the Photoshop work that I do in layers with people and flowers. I recently took, I did this series about a year and a half ago in the winter, right on the rail trail over by the CCBA over there, with a friend of mine who agreed to come out for the second time and work with me. She came from Keene to work with me. So this one, I had wrapped up taking a course by a photographer by the name of Jennifer Thorison. I think she's based out of Santa Fe these days. And her work is surreal and a little weird, and it's kind of cool. She does a lot with textiles. I'm not a textile person, but I was inspired by a lot of what she was talking about in her class on how to create a fine art series. Think about what's meaningful to you, brainstorm, the things that creative people do. So for me, I wrote down a whole list of things, like what's important to me, what are major events in my life, what's significant. And so one of the things that I decided to do some work on was the loss of my mother. She was only 63 years old. She died 30 days after she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. We really didn't have a whole lot of time to process the information, but that was a significant moment. She was a highly spiritual person. She was also a hospice volunteer. She was a psychic medium. Death was not something that was scary to her. So she wasn't afraid to die. She knew it was coming. And it seemed to be the most appropriate thing to pay homage to her life and to her passing, and to really mostly my process in grieving. And I was hoping that anybody who views this work who's also lost, it touches them, and somehow there's a connection to their own loss. So I was trying to create something that connected with other people, that wasn't so much just about me, or wasn't necessarily beautiful, which a lot of my work is. So I did the different stages of grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who's kind of the person who kind of laid out the stages of grief in her book on death and dying many years ago. That's what inspired me. So I did denial, which is in this one, and there's a lot of things that are symbolic in the work, like the shawl was my mother's, blackbirds are my mother, and I actually took the text from Kubler-Ross's books. This is from about denial. If you look closely, you'll see the word denial in the picture. That I overlaid it into the picture. So that's denial. This one's bargaining. This one's bargaining. Whoops. And they're not in any order, because if you know anything about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work, she says that the grieving process does not happen in order. You may go back to denial after you do bargaining. You may go back to anger after so because it's not a linear thing, the work shouldn't be presented in a linear way either. So this is bargaining. This one is anger. And the picture is actually a picture in the town from Italy, where my mother's ancestors were from. I overlaid it and put it in the background of the image. So actually, we set up a little smoke bomb too. This is acceptance. So just, she's sort of letting go, surrender, if you will. And then this one is, obviously, this is depression. And those are the five pieces from that series. And she died in the winter. So everything was kind of significant that I worked into the shoot. So that one is highly symbolic, highly meaningful. And again, my intention was to sort of talk about a universal thing that humans experience and connect. So that's that. So another thing I'm inspired by is pre-Raphaelite art. It's super femme. Thank you. I love sort of the posing when I approach portraiture. I love some of the posing. There's a famous, Ophelia. I don't have the actual image here, but I did draw. One day I was just sitting on my couch and I drew it. So you may recognize it from my rendering of the painting. But you could see sort of graceful hands, the elongated neck. I'm very inspired by the posing. So I look at art as a way. I look at art I like, and then I'm not reinventing the wheel. I'm imitating art that I like, and so I ended up working a similar approach to my portraiture. So that's that. And I guess the only other thing I would add is that ever since I was little, I wanted to be an artist. That was if you were to ask me when I was a kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? I'm like, I want to be an artist and have my work in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, because I grew up not too far away from there. So that was the goal. That was the end goal, to have my work at the Met. And and that was just sort of my lifelong passion and my lifelong goal. And one of the things I love about AVA, I'm just going to give them a shout out, because I always felt most comfortable and at home in the art room with the art supplies and the art kids. Like that's where I felt, I didn't really feel like I belonged too much, and I'm not really a joiner, just that's not my personality, but I loved sort of that feeling of home that I had just around like the smell of paints, and like I love like a pencil, like opening up a pencil box and the smell of my pencils, because I love to draw and I like to paint. I love to do all of that stuff. So being in AVA is so cool because I'm literally surrounded by other artists. That's the energy in the building, and that's where I feel most at home. And I know other people, you know, other colleagues of mine here, we've talked about it, and this place really is a sanctuary. This is like my little sanctuary, this little studio, and I'm just so thrilled to be here. That's all.